Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Kodolakis, and I'm Senior Marketing Manager here at Progress. Welcome to our 6 Steps to Data Democratization Using APIs webinar. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping slides to show you the webinar control panel and how you can participate. First, to open and hide your control panel, you want to click on the orange highlighted arrow at the top, shown here. There are 2 options for joining audio. To use VoIP, simply select Computer Audio under Audio, or to dial in using your phone, select Phone Call and dial in using the numbers and information provided. All lines will be muted for today's session. We'll be taking your questions throughout the presentation. We have a very full discussion today with limited time for questions, so if we run out of time, we'll get back to you at the end of the session. We are recording the session. You'll receive a copy of the recording in the coming days. Now I want to introduce you to our speakers today, Todd Wright and David Lotion. Todd leads global product marketing for Data Direct Solutions for Progress. He works closely with the product management and sales organizations to create and promote materials that are relevant and valuable to Progress customers. He is instrumental in developing customer relationships and creating strategic marketing plans that drive awareness, consideration, education, and demand. David is Principal Consultant of Knowledge Integrity and is recognized worldwide as an information management industry thought leader. He has dedicated years to popularizing best practices for business intelligence, data governance, performance computing, master data management, predictive analytics, and data quality. In addition, he's lecturer and program director at University of Maryland College of Information Studies. Now, before we jump into the discussion, we want to let you all know that this is based on the white paper, 6 Steps to Data Democratization Using APIs, which is now available on progress.com. I'm really excited to have both David and Todd with us today, and now I'll turn it over to Todd to start the discussion. Todd?
Susan, thank you very much. And David, it's good to see you again. I know that we've done a few of these webinars this year in regard to data direct and data connectivity and so forth. And today we are here to talk about your latest paper, 6 Steps to Data Democratization Using APIs. And before we really get into the conversation part and Q&A between the two of us, just want to see if you have any initial thoughts to share with the audience in regard to what the paper is all about from a very high level, and we can just jump in from there.
Sure, and thanks, Todd, and thanks you guys for inviting me to come back and speak again. One of the things that I had started seeing in some of our company's customer engagements, I would say over the last 2 years or so, is an increased interest in the use of APIs, the development of APIs from a operational standpoint to support application development. But what was becoming very apparent is that the value of APIs in supporting data connectivity is actually becoming more and more acute. And the reason for that is that as organizations start moving towards the cloud, they start seeing increased amount of data distribution. So there's a greater complexity in being able to get access to those data objects that people in the organization want to be able to see. And so APIs are becoming, if they haven't already become, a standard mechanism by which the end users or the data consumers are being empowered to be able to get access to their data.
Yep, absolutely. So to really, thanks for that, David. To start with the conversation, I wanted to start really from the beginning of your latest paper. You had mentioned a term called citizen data analyst. And I know in the market, there's another term as citizen data scientist. And I was wondering, if you can comment on that a bit and tell those listening today what those roles might be all about and what unique data needs they may have. I know you mentioned that term throughout your paper, so I just wanted to set the stage on what citizen data analyst means and really go from there.
So to answer, that's a really good question. And to answer that, I think we have to go back in history a little bit to the beginning days of the use of analytics and business intelligence, and to kind of look at who were those individuals in the organization that were tasked with doing the analysis of the data that had been accumulated. And for the most part, it was individuals who were really highly skilled in either data use or running queries or building dashboards or building visualizations. They were individuals who had training in the use of particular types of tools and technologies, and they were on tap for being able to provide service to groups within the organization to be able to answer those types of questions or do the types of analyses that were required. And the more sophisticated the analysis that was expected, you could say that the higher up in that ivory tower those individuals live. What's happened over time is as a byproduct of, I'm going to say, of open source technologies and availability of low cost entry points into doing analysis. So it used to be in the past, you'd have to have an organization spend a couple of $1 million to be able to build a business intelligence capability. Today, you would say that any organization or any small company even that's got access to the internet can log into a cloud service provider account, get access to scalable resources that can be used to do any type of data management activity and be able to have capabilities doing different types of analysis in a simplified way. And so between the evolution of tools, I'll suggest that maybe even the development of open source languages like Python and R have made it much easier for individuals who have not had 5 years worth of schooling and how to do analytics to be able to run the types of analyses that can add value to the organization. And so we refer to these people as citizen data analysts, in that they're people who can open up a tool like a Tableau or a Qlik and be able to build a report without having to have a degree in computer science. And they are able to develop these visualizations and reports that are easily digestible by their targeted audience. So the result is that you've got a lot more individuals who are making use of capabilities that I would say 20 years ago, none of them would have been able to be able to master, let alone use, on a daily basis. And so these individuals, they don't care about the technology, they care about getting access to the data. And that really is when you ask about their types of needs and desires, it's really, they've got the capabilities at their fingertips. They just need to get access to the data.
Sure, sure. So what positives? I mean, I can think of a lot of positives by, having more access to data for more individuals within organizations. But can you think of some of the challenges that organizations now have? Say someone like myself who does not have that computer science degree, but I need to have some robust reporting that I show my managers. What are some of the challenges with that? Having people and more people within an organization having access to potentially even sensitive data or personal data.
So there's a bunch of, you've already made reference to some of them. Number one
Mhm.
is that there's more demand for different types of data. So if we ratchet back to the end of the 80s or the beginning of the 1990s, organizations are building data warehouses where they're sucking data out of their operational systems, and they're allowing people, specialized technologists to run queries on that data to tell you how many widgets were sold in Kansas in November of 1992. But today, there's lots of data. It's made available in a variety of different ways. It lives in a large number of different varieties of platforms. So even if your organization is moving to the cloud, well, some of the data is still sitting on-prem, and some of it is in the cloud, and some of it's in one cloud environment, and some of it's in another cloud environment, and maybe some of it's sitting in a cloud database, and some of it is sitting in object storage. And so knowing where the data is and being able to provide access to that data and be able to provide a composite view of data that is being pulled from a number of different sources, that's one of the big challenges. You made reference to personal data, private data.
Mhm.
Today, there's dozens more data privacy laws that existed than 20 or 25 years ago, and with an increased scrutiny over what information is being used and how it's being used and what are the rights that individuals have to oversee or control the use of their own data. That becomes yet another challenge, is being able to know where all that information is and how it's being managed and to what extent that data is being controlled. And then just being able to provide a composite view of that information is that, as in today's world, there's a desire to have a omni-channel customer experience, and that means being able to pull data from text channels and emails and telephone calls and transaction records, and did that individual arrange for transactions so that they could do a curbside pickup, or do they walk into a store, or do they order online, or do they walk into a store and then order online, which is something that my kids typically do when the right shoe sizes are not available in the style that they like. And
Mhm.
so they'll order the shoes, and while they're standing at the cash register at the point of sale in the physical location, and then they'll go to another location to return the ones that they don't like. So being able to pull all that information and provide a composite view of that is also one of these major challenges.
Yeah, and I can imagine, all the things that organizations are trying to do with data today. There just simply isn't enough of the data scientists or the high end IT people to really be able to meet all these requests. Thus, the democratization of data that you mentioned in your paper, and the need to have more ability for individuals within organizations to do their own data type of work, and pushing it into the tableaus of the world.
So that's a really good point. I mean,
Mhm.
we've used this term data democratization or data democracy or democratizing data. And really what that's saying is it's kind of code in one way, which is saying that IT can't be a bottleneck anymore, that the demand for access to data and doing analytics and doing reporting, or even simple descriptive analytics, it's now organizations, and key stakeholders, they can't wait to queue up their requests with the IT department only to be told that yes, we can get to developing that report for you, in 3 months, uh, when they are just as capable of being able to develop those reports on their own using self-service access to the data. So data democratization is a mechanism or a philosophical approach to ensuring that the all the different types of data consumers are able to get access to the data that for which they have been authorized to view in a timely manner to address the business needs when they need to be addressed.
Yep, makes complete sense. So, David, to jump a little bit deeper into your paper, as you know, the purpose of this webinar today is to really talk about data accessibility, connectivity, and namely from the use of APIs. Towards the beginning of your paper, you mentioned some challenges organizations face modernizing their data landscapes as they migrate their systems to the cloud. Namely, they are faced with a growing conundrum. I'm quoting here from your paper, such as exploiting the benefits of distributing data assets across multiple cloud environments, and not how that complicates data connectivity and consequently data accessibility. And from your paper and that quote, and from your experience, can you give us some examples of this and that you've seen from a lot of the conversations that you have with organizations that are, looking to have a smoother way of managing all this, and namely for
Uh,
APIs?
yeah, I mean, let me kind of go back to that example that I started to allude to before, which was
Sure. Mhm.
specifically about omni-channel customer experience. Is that in the past we would have had multiple, almost different lines of business that are driving what's going on and how data is being connected. So you may have, let's take a big retail outfit that's got a lot of brick and mortar locations. One of the things they will do is they will keep track of all the transactions that are going on within the actual store at the point of sale. But then they will have a web presence, and they'll be keeping track of the data that's associated with the transactions being done through that web presence. And so you've got I don't know what's good example, Sears, since I think they don't exist anymore, if I'm not
One more
mistaken.
year. They have one more year.
Oh, they have one more year. Okay. Well,
Yes.
well, so you've got people walking into the store, and that goes into a completely different system than the data that's being done online. But but the customer wants to know, you know, they'll want to know, what did I order and when did I order it and when did I pick it up and where did I pick it up and when was it delivered, and not only that, they might want to know, well, what's my credit limit and how much have I spent on that credit limit, and that's in another system. And so every time you turn around, there's then they call the warranty repair, and that's yet a third, fourth system. So they've got all this data, and so it's one thing if you've got, you got one data center and all the data sitting in the mainframe, and it's just a question of running the query against the right data set and pulling it into a data warehouse, and now you've got it sitting in your on-premises data warehouse. But today, half the systems are on the cloud, and some of them are on premises, and some of them are in software as a system platforms. And so, the marketing data is in some marketing database, and I'm running Salesforce, and I've got, the cloud-based data system for the online transactions, and I've got an on-premises mainframe database that's got the transactions from the point of sales and stores, and it's no longer easily pulled into a single data warehouse. And yet I want to be able to have access to that data, and I don't want to have to wait, a day or a week for the data to be extracted from the sources and integrated into some analytical environment. It's really, like when I made that transaction yesterday, you should be able to check your system and tell me where that is in the fulfillment and shipping. So these are, all these data sets are sitting in different platforms, and different platforms. Some of it is within your data center and completely within your control. Sometimes it's on public cloud, maybe it's in private cloud, maybe some of it is in some software as a system. But you want to be able to provide accessibility to a uniform and unified view to address customer requests, in a timely manner. And I think that really is a pretty good example. I mean, another good example would be in a financial institution. So, you think about your bank. Well, the bank provides you with a large number of services, right? You have a savings account and a checking account and a money market account, but then there's, this kind of credit card, another kind of credit card. You've got a mortgage with the bank. You took out a loan for your car. There's a certificate of deposit. There's, they're branching out into maybe doing insurance services. Each one of those is a separate system. You want to be able to get access to all that data because the customer experience is really driving how the business is running.
That makes complete sense as well. And thank you for diving a little bit deeper in that. I know that you had touched on it from some of the previous answers to my questions. But I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit further in regard to APIs. You had mentioned in the paper and here within our discussion as well, how APIs have been around for decades. And you also mentioned that APIs today are significantly more sophisticated than those the ones that were used for remote procedure calls and requests of the past. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on this. Where have you seen the use of APIs really surpassing, from a benefit perspective, where they once were back in the dark ages, so to speak?
I have to admit, my experience with these types of protocols of how an API works goes back to when I was actually in graduate school, and I was developing mechanisms for doing embedding remote procedure calls within application within the languages to be able to automatically configure RPCs, to be able to provide a service from the caller to the from the respondent to the caller. So the caller would say, could you please do some action for me, and then send that off to another service, and the service would then do that and then respond back saying, I just did that. And in a remote procedure call mechanism, like I said, that's been around for a long time. It was really more actions as opposed to data provision. What we're seeing now are these APIs are an architectural paradigm or an architectural framework for providing accessibility to data, as well as providing some kind of capabilities on the service side. So it's not just, can I have some data, but you can also do the mechanism of, here's some data, can you please update the database for me? Or here's some data, can you now go do some transaction for me? And these APIs, there's, if you kind of look about 10 years back, the concept of web services and service-oriented architectures and how those were evolved into, the REST model, where there's no expectation of maintenance of state across those different calls, allows APIs to have developed into essentially a lightweight mechanism for doing requests for service or requests for information. And that, I think, is what has really expanded out the use of APIs. And if you think about, if you go back to our conversation that we had with AB on that other webinar about the annual report, a bunch of the questions we're asking people in these organizations: are you using APIs? Are you using other developed APIs? Are you developing your own APIs? And what's interesting to see is that there really isn't a step up that from what we'd seen in earlier years in adopting the use of essentially APIs as a product. So it's not, okay, well, here's a hack I need to do to be able to get access to the data, but rather there's an organization that is actively developing APIs as a product or as a mechanism that they can sell or license to others to be able to get access to the data that they want to be able to get access to. And so APIs, are now becoming more of a enabling technology and a core component of a data architecture. So now I wouldn't even think, if I were developing a new system, I wouldn't even think about not providing an API.
Yeah, makes sense. And you had also, within your paper, to segue on everything that you had mentioned, you said the use of APIs into the use of APIs to help democratize data is really helping out with challenges such as seamless methods for data access. You had listed out simplified interfaces for data consumer interaction, managing data availability, and integrated data controls. Can you discuss those a little bit more? I know that you've touched on probably all four of those, but could you discuss those a little bit more and how the actual APIs are helping with those challenges, the four that you had mentioned in your buckets?
So what we can do now is we can kind of marry both sides, right? Which is on the one side, we've got this evolution of distributed data that is living in a whole number of different systems, and a desire to be able to gain accessibility to that. But on the other side, we've got our citizen data analysts and citizen data scientists who want a simplified mechanism to be able to get access to that. And what we see in the middle is this whole question of, I want to see, let's say I'm an analyst. I want to see customer data. I don't care where that customer data lives. I don't care what system it came from. In fact, I want you to just give me the data. I don't really care. Yet on the systemic side, I've got, let's use a financial institution example. We've got mortgage data, and we've got checking account data and savings account data and car loans and insurance and investments and mortgages. Those are all different systems. So what we want to be able to do is simplify it so that the data consumer doesn't have to say, okay, now I have to run a query against the mortgage system. Now I have to run a query against the bank system. Now I have to run a query against the car loan system, and essentially, be able to provide a seamless mechanism, which says the API just says the consumer facing part of that says you can request data about the customer or about the individual. And on the service side of that, it actually farms out all the federated queries that says, okay, now I'm going to run a query against each one of those different systems that contains customer information. And the API itself is going to be able to compose the partial results, you might say, into a uniform representation that is then streamed out to the requester. So this is where we get the seamlessness of the data access, because as far as the data consumer is concerned, or the data analyst is concerned, they don't need to know where all the data is. They just call the API, and the API figures it out for them, because the API has been configured to be able to know where the sources are and how to get access to that. And by doing this, that now becomes, it simplifies the interface, because the data consumer doesn't need to do anything other than run the query.
Mhm.
It's like, give me all the data about customers, or give me all the data about products, as opposed to having to have knowledge of where the source of that information is. The other part of this, the third bullet item that you kind of mentioned is data availability, which is as far as the data consumer is concerned. If they get a response, if the data is available, they'll get it in the response. So the API is managing the availability, because it's the developer of the API that says, oh, Todd just called me and said that there's a new customer database that contains information about holiday savings plans, or flexible spending accounts that we're managing as well. And so he tells me where the data set is and what the accessibility is, and in addition, what the authority is to be able to see that data, and I can embed that directly now into a new version of the API, and I can create a new API, or a new iteration or a new version of that API that includes those new data sources. And so when somebody comes around and says, okay, I need to get access to that customer data, if they are authorized to see that data, then they will be able to, when they run the API, it'll return all the data that is available. And again, the consumer doesn't need to know that there's a new data source, or that a prior data source has changed. And this is that last item that you mentioned, which is data controls. And again, this goes back to privacy and protection of personal information, and authority, or authorization to be able to get access to data, and authentication of who the consumer is. And one of the nice things about the way we can build an API is we can embed all that directly within the API, which is that as long as I've got an other, mechanism for managing, authorization and control, I can embed that directly into the data, into the mechanism. So, if somebody comes and says, well, I need to get access to customer data, but that individual is, as by role, doesn't have the authority to see the investment account information for the particular data set, then the API will be able to validate that on the consumer side. So like when the consumer makes that request, the API says, okay, well, what this consumer, this data analyst has the right and privileges to see the following data set. So I will only compose a result that has data from sources that individual is got privileges to see. And not only that, what that means is that I could develop different iterations or different versions of the API that completely mask out data sources that are intended to be protected under particular types of context. So certain data you can only see if it is if it's intended for support a legal obligation, or supporting a legal requirement. So that data is invisible to everybody other than the legal and compliance department and somebody from legal and compliance, because their request is in the context of legal of observing a legal obligation. They're going to be able to see it while everybody else won't be. So I can integrate that control mechanism based on roles, based on an attribute-based access control mechanism as well, and embed that all directly within the API itself, the code.
Makes sense. You made a really good point. It really made me think of my role in marketing. I need data, and I really don't care about how the machinery is working and where it's coming from and how it's all happening. I just need to have the data. I need to be able to report on it. However, there has to be people within organizations, obviously, that set all this up and make everything work seamlessly for roles such as myself. And I was just curious, what are some of the pitfalls or gotchas that organizations need to really look out for when they're setting up everything that you had mentioned as in a sophisticated way of getting the data in the data democratization to the people that really don't know or frankly don't care how it all works, but there has to be a way that it all works. I was just curious how the pitfalls that organizations should look out for when they're really starting to or expanding on such a data program.
So that's a really good question, and I think one of the things that it points to well, there's two things. One is what I'll refer to as the governance gap, which is that the knowledge of what is and what is not acceptable in terms of data access and data control. You've got the legal and compliance folks who know what the law is, but they're not technologists and they're not implementers, so they don't really know, how to make that operationalized. And you got the technology people, and they understand how to operationalize these things, but they're not really the people who can interpret what the law says. And then you've got the data consumers or the analysts, and they don't really care about what the law is. They just want to do their job, which is to analyze the data. And so you've got these three different, parties or sets of parties or communities in the organization, and no single one is tasked with owning governance over those controls. And so the complexity exists when in the past I would have a single database and I would be able to provide access based on who you were and what you were doing. So, okay, well, it's Todd, and I know Todd's working for marketing, so I will give Todd access rights to the data that is appropriate for people who work in marketing. But what happens when Todd decides he's going to move? He's got his MBA and now he's moving into the finance department, and now I got to go track down all the databases that I gave Todd rights to, just to make sure that he still has access, rights to or privileges to that data. And so if I'm doing it on an individual by individual basis, that'll work if you have a company of 20 people. But if you got a company of 3,000 people, that becomes complicated. And so you start, transitioning to maybe a role-based access control. So somebody who works for marketing can get access to this data set. And that probably also worked well when there weren't, 100 different data privacy laws, that each one of them had slightly different characteristics associated with the context in which privacy was being enforced and the individuals that are subject to the rights assured by those laws, and the requirements for observance and auditable enforcement of those laws. And so a lot of that has to do with differing variations on the definition of what is or is not personal or private data. So, under GDPR, the definition of something that's private may be different than the definition of what's private under or personal data under the California law. And that may be much more stringent than the definition of what's private or personal under the Virginia law or under the Singapore law or China law. And so now it's not just characterizing access control as in the context of what the role of the individual is. It's also what data they're trying to access and under what circumstances they're trying to access it. And this becomes really complicated. Now, you've got attribute-based access control mechanisms. You got mechanisms for doing encryption. You got mechanisms for doing masking. But when are all those things being applied, and under what circumstances, and for whom, and at what time? And that's what's great about APIs is that I can capture a lot of the context based on how that API is being invoked. So if it's being invoked by a customer who's sitting in line at the drive-through at the bank, who wants to know what their balance is, that's very different than if I'm a guy in marketing who wants to kind of poke around in celebrities' accounts and see how much money people have, which is not an appropriate use. And so you can embed all that control in the API because the API knows how it was being called. So there's actually some real interesting opportunities for leveraging the API paradigm for managing some of the complexities that you were asking me to point out.
Okay. So, David, I'm going to go a little bit off script here and away from your paper. There's a term or new trend that is being mentioned out in the market. It's called cloud repatriation. While Amazon and the Azures of the world are still seeing a lot of growth, obviously, within their cloud services, there's been a trend where certain organizations, or maybe several organizations, are pulling certain data away from the cloud and moving it back on premises, or maybe even a private cloud. I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit, and why do you see particularly that trend starting to happen? And is APIs have anything useful as far as that trend is concerned?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think there may be a couple of justifications that are driving that. One might be misunderstanding the degree to which controls can be executed on data in the cloud. I think probably a large part of that might have to do with missed expectations for performance. That there's this presumption that okay, I've moved to the cloud and now everything's going to run much faster. And some of the things I've heard, whispers in the hallway is, oh yeah, we moved to such and such a system, but it costs a lot more than we expected, or costs more than it cost while we were using our data warehouse appliance, or it in order to get the performance that we expected, we have to size the cloud configuration much bigger than we thought, or these are all and I'm just speculating. But what's nice about APIs is that you can tinker with under the hood. If the data is sitting on the cloud today and tomorrow it was pulled back on-prem, well, the API can remain the same, because the API, you just have to change I'm sorry, I should rephrase that in saying that the interface to the consumer of the data can remain the same. And all I need to do is change the guts of the API to point to the right place where the data actually is sitting. So if the data were on the cloud today and I decided next week we're going to put it into an on-premises system, I just change it to be able to invoke the request on the database in the on-premises system. But as far as the developer or the analyst is concerned, it didn't really matter where that data set was.
So someone like myself in marketing wouldn't know the difference.
You probably wouldn't know the difference.
Yeah.
And that, same thing if you move from public cloud to private cloud, the only differences you might see is that if there was inadvertent exposure of data that to someone who didn't have the privileges to see that data, that person might run the query or run the request and find that they don't get access to the thing they probably should have had access to in the first place. That might raise some eyebrows, but it's that repatriation might be to alleviate vulnerabilities of access that the organization is trying to be a little more conservative.
Yep, makes sense. David, I know I've asked a lot of questions and we've covered a lot. At this point, just wanted to see if you had any final thoughts in regard to APIs in general, the great white paper that you wrote. Just wanted to close out with your thoughts and what organizations should really take from this paper as the final takeaway or the big takeaway.
So I think this is something that's becoming apparent in a large number of different types of scenarios, which is that systems are being built without understanding the business context for which they need to be built, and activities are being done. I mean, it's interesting. Even like a week ago, I was at a conference and had a conversation with some folks, and they were talking about data policies, and I asked about what's your approach to understanding what policies there are? And they immediately started rattling off the tools that they bought. And I said, okay, well, now you got all those tools, what are you going to do with them? And they kind of like shrugged their shoulders and said, well, I guess we got to figure that out. And what I'm finding is that we've done this project with a number of different clients now. So I'm talking about my role at Knowledge Integrity is that we've been engaged to do what I would call a business value assessment of information use, where what we're looking at is, like as organizations are migrating their data from on-prem to the cloud, there's a great opportunity, right? It affords the opportunity to really rethink how you want to manage your data. And part of that is looking at who's using the data and what are they using it for, and what's the business value of what they're doing. And you can have like fascinating questions with people who are raising questions about the democracy of data or the utility of data in terms of what their business objectives are. That is very different than the types of metrics that data people typically look at. So I might look at the data availability as a characteristic of data quality and say, well, it's either available or it's not. But when you talk to the business people, they'll say, well, we know that the data is in the system, but it takes such and such a number of days for it to propagate through so that it updates in the queries that we run. So there really is a metric associated with data availability, which is the latency between when the information was put into the system and the time that it was made available. And the issue is not, okay, well, we want to see all the data at one time. It's really, I can't sell to my desired target audience if I don't have a full set of up-to-date information about what their accounts look like. And so the delay in doing that actually pushes out the time to value for the use of the information and diminishes the return on the utility of that data, because they can't close the deal, or they can't put together a proposal, or they can't, propose a particular type of product because they don't have the information that they need when they need it. And when you start looking at that, it's really, and I talk about this as the first step in the paper, which is identify and categorize the data consumption use cases. Learn who are the people who are using the data and how are they using it and what are they using it for? Or I should probably turn that around. What are they using it for and how are they using it? And what are the impediments to being able to get the best use out of that? Because that is really going to drive not just the democratization, quote unquote, but really how am I making information available and under what circumstances, and what are the criteria that I need to address in order to be able to best satisfy what those data consumers need from the business perspective. And it's hard to get your arms around. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why we've gotten some interest from companies out there in helping them do this. Is that I'll refer back to that governance gap that I talked about before, which is the data consumers, they've got limited visibility into aspects of managing the data, and the legal people or the people who are defining the business processes, they've got limited visibility into the mechanics. So being able to have an agent who kind of sits between all those different parties and be able to really ask the right questions and then be able to translate the answers into the lingo that each one of those groups understands, I think has become a critical linchpin in being able to have an effective migration or modernization to the cloud, or determination as to whether we don't want to put data on the cloud.
Yep. What an interesting thing that you had just discussed was organizations through the process of moving from on-premises to the cloud or vice versa are being forced to really look at their program. And I thought that was really interesting as well back in the 2018 timeframe when GDPR really did that as well. A lot of organizations might not have had a data governance program in place. Well, here comes this massive new compliance law out of EMEA forcing organizations to do that. So, and I also I thought it was interesting you had mentioned that you were talking to an organization that had bought a lot of tools. and had not had an idea of their data governance program or their data management program. So are you still seeing a lot of that, or was that like a real outlier?
It's not an outlier.
Not an outlier.
It is the common practice. And I think the reason for that is organizations, organizations don't think. It's people inside the organizations that do the thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But decisions are made at the organizational level. And so the challenge is we see a problem and we want to figure out a way to address it, as effectively as possible. And such a vendor, or three of these vendors in the same space, they say, here our product will solve your problem. And the truth is their product will solve their problem under the right circumstances, meaning that the organization knows what the problem is and that the right set of guidance, and advisors come in and kind of map out what the processes are for adopting that technology. And that's true when it comes to data governance, or data integration or master data management or data connectivity. And I think, we can reflect this back to APIs, because this kind of gives you this context of hands-on, what are people using the data for? That's what is kind of driving the development of an API. And that's one of the reasons why I said that was kind of the first step in that process. I mean, the second step is essentially, doing a catalog, like what are the data assets that people want to be able to get access to, be able to put together a registry of what those data assets are so that people are aware of what's there, and that you can start developing your APIs to target those data sources, not just, oh, okay, I want to get access to the sales database, but rather I want to get access to information about customers and how we've communicated with them about sales. That's a different way of stating that, and that communication is not about just running a query against a particular database, but rather how do I configure a result set that is answering the business user's question. And that's where we have, we start to inject some intelligence into the use of tools and technologies. Is not, the tool can do X, but rather, but because the tool can do X, I can do Y.
Mm-hmm.
And why, but if I figure out what I want to do, if I figure out that I'm doing Y, then it tells me that X is the right thing to do.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And tools alone obviously won't do that. It has to have some planning beforehand.
Right.
Yep.
Well, I mean, like the shovel's
Yep.
not going to dig a hole.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
I mean,
well, David, I think we can end with that. I think the really good lasting thought is, as good as technology is, as good as tools are, use of APIs, it really does take a concerted effort and plan before you do it. I think that's a good final thought. With that, I once again, thank you for your time, David. Some great insights given today. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. And if you have any questions, we're more than happy to help you out here at Data Direct. And I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, David.